Good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of the Italian Association for Energy Economics, I welcome all the participants to the 6th Symposium on Current and Future Challenges on Energy Security, and heartily thank our sponsors for supporting its organization. This event is held in a peculiar period of our life. This period is dominated by planned and also unexpected responses to the pandemic crisis. First of all, I recall the Recovery and Resilience Facility plan, which is very important because at least 37% of the 750 billions of the recovery funds are devoted to climate action. That is a very important contribution. In June 2021, European Union adopted the new climate law, which made both the more ambitious target to 2030, that is minus 55% reduction in CO2 emission, and the climate neutrality by 2050, operative and binding. That is very important. Consequently, the European Commission presented the Fit for 55 package, including a lot of challenging proposals. I mention only some of the more relevant. First of all, the revision of the ETS, including this time also maritime and aviation sectors. Secondly, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is a very difficult measure to be achieved, but very important. Moreover, amendments to the directive on renewables and to the directive on energy efficiency to allow to achieve the new targets by 2030. Last but not least, the revision of the regulation setting CO2 emission for cars and light transportation means that will make more difficult to register conventional cars. On the contrary, the final results of the Glasgow Conference on Climate were mostly disappointing. For instance, the final document doesn't include the full phase out of coal, but only a very mild target on coal phase out. And moreover, there are no firm commitments on financing both poor country, and especially the island that are threatened by the with extinction because of the heightening of the sea level. Last but not least, today's global increasing in the raw material and energy prices could affect the current energy policies, which imply a large use of minerals and metals. The unusual increment has raised a considerable interest from all analysts of the energy transition, and according to most of them, this increase could make much more difficult the achievement of the targets that were devised for the climate change contrast. That is a more important and diffuse opinion. On the contrary, the International Renewable Energy Agency is much more optimistic, because according to its analysis, there are potential solutions utilizing both new technological improvement and a better performance of the existing technology means. Secondly, recycling can reduce substantially the demand of new materials. Last but not least, the required results, according to the agency, exist, and one must simply increase today's production. In conclusion, I am confident that the contribution to this symposium will make valuable contributions to deepen many aspects of these issues. Good work to everybody.
Thank you. Matteo.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Matteo di Castelnuovo, and allow me to start with thanking the whole Italian Association for Energy Economics, and specifically our president, Mr. Zorzoli, our past president, Mr. Primio, and our honorary president, Mr. Carlo, Professor Bollino, for making sure that we still have this annual and important event, which is this sort of way give us the opportunity to exchange research outcome and insights. And also many thanks also to Mr. Serbu for looking after this particular conference. Now, I think that actually, what Mr. Zorzoli was saying a few seconds ago, I think it's a good synthesis and summary of the complexities and challenges that we are facing. And I wanted to, the other day I was thinking of the one claim in a way from the International Energy Agency when they launched the latest World Energy Outlook. And they said something like, well, a new energy economy is emerging. So the term new energy economy was actually kind of new. I've been working in energy business for over 20 years, but energy economy as such came to me as a new term, which seems to work, if you ask me, because of the kind of challenges that have been described so well from my predecessor. And so, yes, we are living in a new energy economy, which implies that actually energy is becoming paramount in all segments of society. You know, Mr. Zorzoli mentioned about the challenge of net zeros and COP26. Well, let's remind ourselves that 73% of carbon emissions greenhouse gases emissions, come from some kind of energy use. Okay, so energy is very much the center of the kind of transition that we are facing. Now, in that respect, it is my personal opinion that as people who work and live out of the energy business, whether you are mostly like in this particular event, an academic, or even if you are a professional but working within the energy industry and beyond. When I say beyond, I mean that actually nowadays you need to deal with energy also if you are in the automotive industry, right? Whether it's hydrogen or electricity. So in a way, all of us, most of us actually kind of used to speak at conferences and webinars, maybe being interviews in the media, because of the energy prices and etc. And that's all very good. But if you ask me, that's not enough. And that's not enough because I think we can all make an effort to make energy more accessible and intelligible to the wider sort of population, because there is so much at stake, okay? And so we really have to obviously continue with our applied research and make it available. There's no doubt about that, obviously, given the complexity of the challenges that we face. But we also, in my opinion, that we also need to make sure that we do a better job in terms of communicating what is happening, and above all, what is going to happen in the coming years. Because if I think that, actually big challenges, issues, call it whatever, that we actually face. One is some people call the energy crunch. So the raw materials skyrocketing, energy prices, gas prices, etc. And you hear all sorts of stories out there, And above all, what is even more dangerous, all sorts of solutions being proposed, especially by certain politicians. So, and this is in the short run. So in the short run, we are facing skyrocketing energy prices, and we know, if we are in the business, that this bumpy road is going to happen over and over again in the coming years. Okay, it will going to be a very volatile market in the coming years, and this is for the short run. But in the long run, obviously, we have an energy transition to do. Okay, we have to reach net zero for reasons which are way too obvious to all of us. And again, the complexity, the uncertainties, the technological risk, this will work, this will not, and etc. And all of this means that actually this kind of discussion cannot be confined to our events, to our webinars, and to the conference. But we need to do as much as possible to convince people, to make people understand what is happening. If my son, who is 9 years old, okay, obviously to me the brightest, but obviously 9 years old, and he asked me the other day when I had my third jab, Dad, did you do a Moderna or a Pfizer? I mean, 9 years old. I mean, if my son knows about that, I think that we cannot accept the fact that actually although somebody grown-ups don't really understand what is causing climate change and what are the consequences of taking certain consumption decision as opposed to others, okay? We're all kind of becoming expert in virology in the last 2 years, unfortunately. I think we can do so much better in terms of the energy transition. And so this is actually my wish for you participants, and thanking you for being part of this event, and wishing that all of us can actually will give a contribution to this sort of much more extended engagement with the wider population with regards to what is happening, whether it's energy crisis or the energy transition. Thank you for the attention, and very much I wish you the best of time and discussion for the next 3 days. Thank you, and back to Rome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Carlo Di Primio, past president IAEE and conference steering committee chair. I add my welcome to all the participants to our symposium, which is at the 6th edition this year. When we started in 2016 with the first edition, we chose this period of the year, although in Europe and in the North Hemisphere is not the best for a conference held in presence, for the incoming winter and the proximity of the winter holidays at the end of the year. The main reasons is that we didn't want to interfere with the IAEE conferences, and at the same time we wanted to fix a period that we could maintain for the following years and make our conference a recurrent event. We reached this target, and today our symposium is an expected rendezvous at the end of the year. Moreover, the last years, more or less in the same period, there have been a United Nations climate change conferences, COP24, COP25, COP26, which took place respectively in Katowice, in Madrid and Glasgow. This proximity of dates gave our symposium the opportunity to be one of the first venues where it is possible to assess and comment on the results of the United Nations Climate Change Conference. The special condition has been particularly remarkable, especially in the current year, for two additional reasons. One, a close connection between the global economic impact due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the necessity to increase the effort to speed the energy transition. The second is the G20 meeting held in Rome immediately before our COP26 and focused on climate change as one of the main items of the agenda. As a steering committee chair of the IAEE conference, it is not my task to open the discussion on the COP26 expectations and results, but I can confirm that many plenary and concurrent sessions of our conference will give the opportunity to the speakers and to the other participants to assess and comment on the conclusion of the United Nations Conference, offering a wide spectrum of the reaction from the academic, industry, and institutional world. The 2 days and a half of the IAEE conference will be structured in 7 plenary sessions and 20 concurrent sessions with more than 100 speakers coming from 26 countries. The main subjects that have been of interest to our participants from the list we proposed were mainly centered on the aspect of energy security connected with the energy transition, energy efficiency, and the effort to achieve net zero climate goals, the smart mobility, the energy markets, carbon pricing, distribution, and storage. We offer a comprehensive program and try to keep the organization of our virtual conference as close as possible to the structure of the previous in-person editions. I would also like to thank all the members of the Scientific and Program Committee for their precious contribution to the evaluation and selection of the abstract that have been submitted. We had more than 40 highest level experts, academics and researchers that have helped us and contributed every year to the success of our conference, enabling us to keep a high standard of our event. The scientific committee ensured the quality and scientific integrity of the works proposed for presentation. They reviewed and approved all the abstracts that were inserted in the program and will be also published in the volume of the conference proceedings and also helped us to identify distinguished keynote speakers for the plenary sessions. I thank you for your attention and I invite Carlo to make his presentation.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for being here. I'm here also thanking all the participants on behalf of the Italian Association of Energy Economics. We can see on the screen essentially a wonderful picture, which means that I consider very important, that Italy, Rome, Milan, is like now in the middle, bridging California, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, east and west of the Europe, which purpose, as you know, to be the center of the climate change. So I will try to be provocative, because then we will have three distinguished speakers that will continue, for this opening. We know that Europe is 400 million people, together with the North American and other developed parts of the world. We hardly reach 1 billion out of the 7 billions of people living on Earth. So when we speak about planet problem, when we pronounce the word world or planet, we Europeans, or we advanced economies, are 1/7 of the rest of the world, okay? So we are trying to propose good ideas because we think we are leaders, we know, but some humbleness should be used. And I do this as a researcher, as an academic researcher. We have absolutely to try to continue to develop this type of meetings, events, so that exchanges of ideas are not self-fulfilling only in terms of proclamation or determination of goals like net zero by the year 2050, or elimination or phasing out of coal whatsoever, because we can say this one as Europeans, as advanced researchers, but we know that others have different opinions, and because we live in the same we speak in the same word, obviously we have to be careful in Anca, che succede qua? Okay. The television is going, okay. Excuse me, I had some disconnection of the computer, but the idea is this one. Essentially, what we want to consider is the idea that we have to respect the
Sorry, I think you've gone on mute.
So once we have these views, I think the key word is technology. I would like to consider the fact that we economists, that we are not engineers, have a very important role in understanding the economics, meaning the cost and the viability and the possibility of implementing technologies. Why am I saying this one? Again, with a lot of humbleness with respect to engineers. Because engineers know how to build things and stuff and technology. But we know how to consider not only the private cost, but also what we know and we consider is the social cost, the externalities, the non-market portion of our economic activity and social activity in the planet, in such a way that the possibility of having countries, people accepting ideas are important for the future of our planet. Okay, that is why I like to see famous and important economists like Sioshansi. On the one hand, California, of course, a forerunner of a lot of green climate change, views of the future of the human mankind. California has always been a forerunner. But I also, acknowledge Lucille Dufour, that is absolutely important, because it's coming from another very important country, energy-producing country. And then we have Dr. Majid Moneef, who is a respected and well-known personality worldwide on understanding the issues of energy and of the energy markets, like the oil markets. So that is the view that we have in front of us. Our conference, as already mentioned by Mr. President and the conference chair, Mr. Primio, is certainly a success. I'm optimistic because we have more than 20 parallel sessions with researchers from many countries. Our symposium in December of the year is like the conclusion of an academic course that runs through the year and prepares for the next one. And about the issue of decarbonization, I would like to simply say something in this moment disconnected with the policy and relevant issues, but of general view that should guide us as researchers for the future. Remember, we're posing targets to the year 2050. So 30 years from now, we are not making a research plan for the next 2 years, 3 years, which is, a respectful way of conducting academic activities. We are looking for something that should happen 30 years from now. Now, if we were in the year 1900, thinking what would have happened in 30 years later, in the year 1930, probably nobody was forecasting the Great Depression, okay? If we were in the 1930, the Great Depression, 30 years ahead of time, 1960, was the moment of consumerism, booming growth, reconstruction of our societies after Bretton Woods and the Second World War in a manner that was unprecedented in terms of welfare given to the population of America and then of reconstruction Canada, Europe, and Japan and other countries. Okay, so let's be humble. We really do not know what will be the technology in 30 years from now. Will that be batteries? Will that be hydrogen? Will that be something else? We have to understand, and as economists, we have the privilege and also the duty, I think, to understand the economics, that is what is the cost in terms of private market and social cost and benefit analysis of what will happen and should happen. With this one, I think we can start, if Carlo, you agree, President agrees, we can start our conference giving the floor to our distinguished speakers. Yes. That our president will have the privilege to announce.
Now, the next speaker is Majid Al-Moneef, which is chair of the International Association for Energy Economics 2023 Committee and chairman of the International Advisory Committee of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. He will speak on a very important item, perspective of the impact of the energy transition on the oil and gas producing states. Please, Dr. Moneef.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Speaking for myself, and I am sure most of quite the majority of the participants, we would have liked to be physically in Rome at this time. But given the circumstances, I'm glad to be with you here, and I'd like to commend very much the program. With your permission, we will take your program as a good reference to our next international energy conference in Riyadh in the early 2023. And I look forward to see you all in Riyadh the year 2023, and hopefully, and God willing, physically around that time. My talk will be on the energy transition facing oil and gas producers. As we all know, energy transition, or to be exact, energy transitions, has been gaining ground, and there are numerous scenarios that had cloud more or less the energy and the climate change pictures. The scenarios, the energy transition scenarios, range from fast to slow, from chaotic to smooth transition. This is partly due to the various technological, behavioral, environmental, investment, and trade issues impacting the patterns and the speed of the transition. Compared to the previous energy transitions, this particular transition underway is mostly driven by governments and international treaties other than markets and technology, which were the main driver of the previous energy transitions worldwide. This transition also relies more on manufacturing rather than extractive process, which is a very, very important to the global world. The transition relies on electricity, with around 30% traded across borders, compared to 74% for oil and 32% for gas trade. So if and when oil and gas supplies are needed during that transition and beyond, some few suppliers will dominate the trade flows, which will impact the pattern and the direction of world trade and consequently energy security. This transition requires much larger investment than any other energy transition worldwide, and it will be across the globe in all countries. It is estimated that around something $1 to $2 trillion will be needed annually in clean energy investments in developing and emerging economies to achieve a net zero emissions by 2050. In this transition, perceptions, risk preferences, and investment behaviors are shifting faster than actual changes in the energy mix. There is wide discrepancy between ambitions and reality. For example, net zero pledges by 2050 cover 70% of world's emissions, while legally binding pledges cover only 20%. Generally, the global energy transition scenarios are built on assumptions about the economic and population growth, the transformations in transport, decarbonization policies, and the global carbon price. For example, it is estimated that a $50 carbon price would add $230 per year to the cost of driving a gasoline or diesel powered car, and would add $140 per ton to the price of coal. This will ultimately impact fossil fuel markets during the transition. It is important to consider the fact that the current transition itself might be, quote, oily, which means that the scenarios of the demise of oil might be highly exaggerated. For example, electrification of the passenger cars has not yet reached aviation, shipping, and trucking. Plastics are still used in electric cars, in wind towers, in solar panels, and airframes for airplanes. Needless to say that most scenarios overlook the needs and aspirations of the developing countries. Today, more than 2 billion people still do not have access to clean cooking, and 1 billion lack electricity. Some 30 years from now, another 2 billion energy consumers will be added to the global population. The scenarios also often sideline the issue of energy security and affordability. Historically, energy consumption has been more of additions than substitutions. It took oil 100 years to surpass coal as world's primary energy source. Yet, coal used today is almost 3 times as much as it was in the 1960s. Even if and when oil peaks, it will still be needed to ensure smooth transition. The role of oil and gas in global energy and emissions is well known. So is the Middle East role in their global trade. The region contributes around 30% of world oil and gas production and trade, and about 40% of its capital investments. While the EU, I remind me to say this, debates the role of natural gas in its climate change responses, Saudi Arabia is investing $68 billion in the next 10 years to develop its unconventional gas. And India is building a $60 billion natural gas infrastructure system. Switching the power sector in India from coal and that of Saudi Arabia from oil to gas requires such mass investments in gas and in its infrastructure. Faced with the public pressure, many international oil and gas companies are incorporating climate objectives into their strategies. Some are reducing the share of oil assets and increasing the shares of gas and renewables, which is welcome. Overall, oil and gas upstream capital investment has fallen by something like 50% below the historical norms. I'd like to point out, from my perspective, that the speedy switch away from hydrocarbons through reduced investments can cause supply shortfalls and price volatility, since supplies are likely to decline faster than the demand fall. This will have its own market and trade consequences. A smooth energy transition will require oil and gas sources investments into the 2050s. So far from reducing investments, investment will also be needed for a smooth transition. I also would like to add that the trade in critical minerals for renewables and electric vehicles is estimated to increase from 10% of energy-related trade to around 50% by 2050. This transition might also have its own geopolitical consequences, with some countries controlling the supply chain for minerals necessary in the transition to decarbonize, to a decarbonized world, such as cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, and rare earths. Now, as to the challenges facing the oil and gas exporters. It is projected that peak oil demand would lead to lower export revenues in oil and gas of the countries, the oil and gas producing countries. Also, peak oil, or the speed of which, will face those countries with different trade-offs. Some might rush to monetize their reserves, while others might diversify into the hydrocarbons value chain. The impact and responses differ across countries depending on their resource endowment and dependence. They also differ in the efficiency, governance, and sophistication of their oil sector. Many high oil producers could be priced out of the market as demand falls. This may boost the power of the Middle East oil producers, whose low production cost and low emissions and low methane emissions and low gas flaring will give them an edge in the energy transition. Like for Saudi Arabia, being a leader within this Middle East hydrocarbon producing group, we believe that our oil supplies will be required when many other producers exit the market, and when all use continue to be in selected sectors. Realizing the challenge of global energy transition and the prospect of slower oil demand, Saudi Arabia has set up its own energy transition through the following. First, we're investing in energy efficiency and enacting very ambitious energy price reform to change our energy mix. We're adopting an ambitious renewable program, of which we have an edge, especially in solar power. This investment, as of now, by the year 2024, will account for $25 billion. Our investment in renewables and in our natural gas, including the unconventional, is projected to phase out around 1 million barrels per day of our oil consumption by the year 2030. This will help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and meet the increasing domestic demand for electricity in a more climate-friendly manner. We are developing and marketing green and blue hydrogen and ammonia, and promoting circular carbon economy, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and direct oil capture. In IEA's net zero by 25 scenario, IEA anticipates that trade in hydrogen and ammonia will rise from less than 1% today to more than 1/3 of all energy-related transactions, and we'd like to be part of this. If so, then we plan to be leader in the hydrogen, whether green or blue hydrogen. The carbon capture, circular carbon economy can play a key role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the reduction, reuse, recycling, and removing of carbons. In a new constructed CCE, Circular Carbon Economy Index for 30 countries and 20 oil producers to quantify and compare country performances and potential for reaching CCEs, Saudi Arabia was ranked 6th, and we endeavor to move up in that group. We are introducing an integrated program to leverage non-combustible uses of oil, such as non-metallic materials for construction, housing, automotive, solar, and wind. We are leading the Middle East oil and gas producers in announcing an ambitious net zero emissions target by 2060, which is a major undertaking on our part. Our national oil company, Aramco, is engaged in the global framework on ESG metrics, that's environmental, social, and governance metrics, which until now have been largely from the perspective of developed markets, publicly listed companies. The environmental metrics, for example, do not take into account the contribution of reliable and affordable energy in supporting social development, while the social metrics do not weigh enough the contribution of oil to our national economy and in human resource development. The governance metrics are framed from a publicly listed company perspective. Issues such as board structures and relationship with governments do not take account of the shareholding structure of NOCs. In a nutshell, the hydrocarbon producers can be part of the solution to mitigate the impact of climate change. Their views and trade-offs they face in the transition towards a decarbonized world will be important towards a smooth global transition. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope that the issues that I had raised, I know they are sensitive, but at least that's the way we see it from our perspective. We want to be part of the solution, not the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moneef, for your valuable contribution to one of the most intriguing issues. It is very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, next speaker is Lucille Dufour, Senior Policy Advisor at the Canadian Institute for Sustainable Development. She will speak on the key trends in energy-related COVID-19 response since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, notably in G20 countries, and moreover, how to align public money commitments with an accelerated clean energy transition towards net zero emission. Please.
Just going to share my screen. It's going to take a little bit of time. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here today. Last year, you had a presentation from one of my colleagues on the earlier findings of the tool that I'm going to talk about today, which is the Energy Policy Tracker. So I'm really glad to be here this year to give you an update of the data that we've been tracking over the past year and give you an overview picture about how the recovery response from governments has unfolded in the past year. So I'm going to go directly into presenting what the Energy Policy Tracker is as a tool, and we'll then go through the main key trends and findings that we have been able to identify over the past month. I will not go into specific countries' findings because we won't have time today, but I really encourage you, if you are interested in looking more into details about specific countries, to go to our platform and check for yourself. I will share the information for you to look at our platform at the end of the presentation. So let me first start by introducing the Energy Policy Tracker as a tool. So basically, in July 2020, with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is an independent think tank working on sustainable issues, we decided to launch with 5 other organizations the Energy Policy Tracker. It's a network of partners which aims at tracking specifically the scale and direction of public money committed to energy and producing activities since the beginning of the pandemic. So as I said, we launched the Energy Policy Tracker in July 2020. In the beginning, we only had a few countries, and in a bit more than 1 year, we grew the coverage to up to 31 countries, as well as 8 MDBs, and we now have more than 1,500 policies that are covered on the Energy Policy Tracker. And the purpose of the tracker from the beginning was really to bring transparency to recovery plans and make sure that we can hold governments accountable on their Build Back Better commitments that were made at the time. And obviously, you may ask yourself why it matters. I think we were pretty clear at the time, and there is no wide consensus around the fact that the public money commitments that are made now are going to shape our energy future and will either accelerate the transition towards more resilient and low carbon futures, or on the contrary, will lock in our economy in high emitting pathways for decade. So this is really what we wanted to test and track by putting together the energy policy tracker, bearing in mind that to stick to the Paris Agreement's objectives and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, this would require a rapid shift of public support from fossil fuels to clean energy. In terms of, very briefly, in terms of what the energy policy tracker covers, we track policies mainly in 4 sectors of the economy, including mobility, buildings, resource extraction, and power generation. It only accounts for 3 to 5% of the total stimulus package worldwide, but we know that these are those sectors, because they are so energy intensive, that are going to have a disproportionate impact on the ability to build back better. Another specificity of the energy policy tracker, and you will see it in a moment, is that we try to classify policies in a user-friendly way, depending on the type of energy that is supported, either clean energy or fossil fuel energy or other energy, and also depending on whether these policies came with green strings attached, and you'll see what it means in a moment. It obviously ended up covering a lot of different instruments, tools that are used by government, because as you know, the recovery response has taken many forms in many different countries. So let's go now to our latest findings as of December 8th of 2021. So just to put things back in context, we all know that many governments and the international community has largely voiced its support to building back better and for a green recovery. We've seen this through international fora, including the G7, the G20, and most recently through the COP26 policy decisions. However, what the energy policy tracker has been consistently showing since its inception is that there is still a large disconnect between the claims that governments are going to build back better and the implementation of this objective. And this is what you see here on the chart on the slide, that actually as of December 2021, fossil fuel related public money commitments still represent 41% of the total public money commitments that we have tracked on the energy policy tracker. And this is almost $900 billion that were approved since January 2020 to support this type of energy. This is more than what has been committed to clean energy. You can see that it's at the moment 37%. And sorry, the number is not accurate on the slide. It's from a previous, it's 335 billion, and actually the total for fossil fuel is 366. This is me not reading well my slides, so this is rectified now. So you can see that basically in 1.5 years of recovery response, governments are still not tipped the balance from fossil fuel to clean. And actually, this is even more interesting when we look specifically into the fossil fuel bucket and into the clean energy bucket, and especially in G20 country. For G20 country, if we look into the fossil fuel bucket, we realize that more than $8 in $10 that were committed to fossil fuels went to projects with no green strings attached. So they benefited fossil fuel intensive activities without requiring any kind of climate targets or reductions in pollutions. And we've seen this kind of stimulus responses, for instance, in Canada, where the government supported the oil and gas industry to recover from the pandemic without asking for any kind of transition of the industry at the same time. And there are many other examples in G20 countries. And similarly, when we look at the clean bucket, so clean public money commitments, we realize that within this almost and more than $300 billion, only $1 in every $10 was committed to the cleanest energy measures, which are renewable energy production or energy efficiency, so the kind of no regret solutions that are going to drive the energy transition faster. So this is the kind of picture that we see overall. And I also wanted to mention that it could only be the tip of the iceberg, because these are only quantified public money commitments. And obviously a lot of governments also use very creative ways of supporting the fossil fuel industry, including introducing weaker regulations for the fossil fuel industry, or postponing requirements for GHG emissions reporting, etc. So that's the static view in December 2021. And what's interesting to look at the same time is how the picture has evolved over time. And this is what we see on my next slide. So you can see here the evolution of public money committed to the different buckets in the energy policy tracker over since the beginning of the pandemic. What's interesting to see is that there is a quite clear differentiation between the short-term responses, the emergency rescue relief packages that were disproportionately benefiting the fossil fuel industry, and recovery plans that were adopted afterwards and that were more targeting clean energy investments in the different sectors that are related to energy production and consumption. So if we focus specifically on G20 countries, we find that the share of clean spending, clean public commitments has increased from 22% at the beginning of the pandemic, so March, May 2020, to 39% from July to September 2021. So this is almost our most recent data. So there is this clear increase in the share of clean public money commitments in the total structure of G20 recovery response, which is to be welcome, obviously. The issue, however, is, as I showed earlier in the static overview, that this has not been enough to tip the balance from fossil to clean. And we now see, and especially since January 2021, fossil fuel public money commitments that continue to increase as, at a stable, relatively stable rate, as well as clean energy commitments. So, which means that governments are both adding new public money commitments to the two sides of the middle, which obviously will not help accelerate the energy transition if more money is constantly going into supporting the fossil fuel industry, either on the consumption or the production side. Let's now turn to a few other findings that potentially can be interesting for you to bear in mind. Here is a view of the individual's country performance, just to show you that obviously this is not an even picture, and different countries have been performing differently depending on their national circumstances. And the key finding here, I think, as well, is to show you that if we look especially at G20 country, no G20 country has a fully clean track record, and you can see it on the bar chart here. The black and gray area all represents the fossil fuel funding that we identified in those countries, and you can see that basically all these countries have a little bit of the gray and black area. So there is no completely clean picture. What's interesting, though, is that in some regions and countries where some specific targets or frameworks were put in place, either before the pandemic or during the pandemic, to proactively green the public money commitments, we see that these countries are performing relatively better. This is the case for the EU countries, as the EU has decided to, through proactive regulations, to earmark 37% of its recovery response to green investments. And this is particularly remarkable in Italy, where you see that most of the recovery actually spending is has now been targeted to clean energy, and other countries such as Canada, where there was a proactive, let's say, policy from the government starting at the end of 2020 and early 2021 to increase the share and amount of green spending in the recovery plans. Just to note that on this graph, the new United States bipartisan plan has not been yet included, and this is why the United States looks so, let's say, biased towards fossil fuel commitments, but this is something that we're going to do very soon. Final and very important point. Per capita, and this cannot be entirely shown on that graph, but per capita global North country have injected more public money in their economies than their global South counterparts. And it's mainly due to a lack of capacity in global South countries to expand their fiscal space and respond effectively to the pandemic, especially in the energy-related sectors. This is obviously a finding that is not only found on the Energy Policy Tracker, but also in many other recovery trackers led by other organizations. And this is particularly problematic because the green recovery must be green everywhere and in an equitable way if we want to fast-track this energy transition. Finally, potentially a quick overview on the public money spent by different sectors. And here it's quite interesting to see that some of the sectors that we've tracked, including the mobility sector, have been absorbing the bulk of the recovery response so far, with, for the mobility sector, almost as much commitments for clean energy as for fossil fuels, and that other actually sectors which could be low-hanging fruits, such as the building sector, where energy efficiency, retrofitting could really drive forward the energy transition, have only received 6% of total commitments that we have tracked on the Energy Policy Tracker. There are also some policies that are low-hanging fruits and that we have not seen really reflected in our database, including, for instance, policies that could raise revenue for the energy transition, such as fossil fuel subsidy reform or fossil fuel taxation. Let me finish by a few recommendations that we think are key for governments, policymakers to take into account if they really want to deliver on their Build Back Better commitment. The first one is obviously to align with 1.5 degrees. I think that there's a growing recognition in the international community that there needs to be this alignment towards 1.5 and net zero by 2050. And it implies committing to a fossil-free recovery where governments refrain to investing further into new production of fossil fuels. And this is obviously aligned with, for instance, the latest IEEE scenario that is compatible with net zero by 2050. There's also, I think, this strong need to attach green strings to policies that may have a detrimental environmental impact. This is really important because obviously governments and the public forces have, public institutions have potential to incentivize and accompany the transition toward cleaner energies. And although some industries may need some support in the short term, they also need to get the right incentives to transition away from fossil fuel consuming activities, for instance, in the longer term. The second recommendation is around raising money for recovery. And I've already talked about fossil fuel subsidy reform and fossil fuel taxation as key tools to do so. This is something that is for now underrepresented in our database, but that could actually raise 100 billions of public funding that could be redirected towards scaling up clean energy investments. When it comes to this scale up of energy investments, here the key things are to focus on no regret clean investments, including in energy efficiency and renewable energy production. And also, as I said earlier, to think about the kind of taxonomies, benchmarks, and targets that could incentivize investments in the right sectors. And again, some of the initiatives that have been taken at the European level to put in place these kind of taxonomies and targets have been partly successful in terms of driving investments towards the clean energy transition. Finally, the last point, which is extremely important, is to ensure that this transition is equitable. As I said earlier, we've seen that countries in the global south were not able to adopt as much new public money commitments as global north countries. So enhanced international cooperation will be extremely needed to make sure that the global south gets the right type of support to build back better from the pandemic and fast track the clean energy transition. And at the domestic level, obviously, the energy transition will have impact on some workers and communities that are affected by the transition away from fossil fuels and into clean energy. So there's a need to really take into account and build the right kind of just transition initiatives to make sure that these more vulnerable groups of the society get the right support to go through this transition in an equitable way. That will be it for me for today. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to explore our database, you can scan the QR code here. And if you don't have the right technology to do it, you can just type on your browser energypolicytracker.org and you will have access to our full data platform. Thank you very much for your attention and happy to answer questions if you have any at the end of this session.
Thank you, Dr. Dufour, for your remarkable survey of often unnoticed financial investments which are making climate action less effective. Thank you very much indeed. And now the last speaker is Fereidoon Sioshansi. I excuse myself for the pronunciation, which is president of the Menlo Energy Economics USA. He will speak on the evolution of consumer demand in the electricity sector. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone. It's I'm still drinking my coffee. It's early in the morning in San Francisco. I appreciate this invitation to speak. I spoke at this event virtually last year, and as Dr. Majid Al-Moneef mentioned, we all wish we could be in Rome in person, but maybe we'll wait till next year. Hope to see you all next year somewhere. Anyway, the conference that is starting obviously covers lots of topics, and we got the flavor of that in the presentations today, which I totally enjoyed, including Dr. Al-Moneef's issues with the speed of transition. I particularly enjoyed his view that the ambitions are exceeding the reality. I totally agree, but nevertheless, you know, it's a long journey, and we need to take the baby steps necessary to make the transition. And I imagine for oil and gas and coal exporting countries, it's quite a difficult and challenging transition, but nevertheless. Anyway, in the few minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about developments which I think are quite interesting in the demand side of the electricity. In other words, how consumers use, and in this case, actually produce some of what they use in the electricity sector. And I think that this is very important for two reasons. The first reason is that as we decarbonize, and Dr. Al-Moneef also mentioned, I believe that long-term trends suggest that the electricity sector will grow in importance as we electrify everything, or things that we can. And that means that the fossil fuel sector will decline eventually, and we can agree or disagree on when and if that will happen and what would be the speed. But I think all trends that everybody's predicting suggest that the electricity sector will rise. And of course, most of that will be produced from low carbon or zero carbon fuels. Otherwise, there's no point of electrification if you're generating electricity from coal. So I think that part, I think everyone agrees on. The second part, which is more interesting, is that in the electricity sector, at least, we have reached this stage in the technological development and cost and benefit where consumers can actually produce part of what they consume, which is pretty bizarre. It's like some, oil car driver generating some of its own petrol in the backyard. That's not done. But in the electricity sector, it is happening, and I think this is something we need to pay attention to. In case you're puzzled what I'm talking about, I'm talking about the revolution in the solar rooftop in the residential sector in particular. We hear a lot about large scale, utility scale, solar and wind and other types of renewables, but I think an interesting development is happening on people's roofs around the world. And because the cost of these panels is falling relative to their value, more people in more places, not everywhere, are putting solar rooftops on their roofs. An example, which I find very interesting, is in Australia. We don't have any speakers from Australia on this panel, but I follow developments in Australia very closely, and I find it interesting that just this year, Australia passed 3 million solar roofs milestone. When you consider the total population of the country is below 25 million, 3 million solar roofs is quite an impressive number. Moreover, the electricity market operator in Australia predicts this number to rise to 6 million by 2030. Roughly 1 in 2 homes in Australia are predicted to produce their own electricity. So this phenomena, about which I've written quite a bit, is the transition of consumers to what we call prosumers. So they will produce and consume, maybe not at the same time, but you get the idea. So if more countries follow what has happened in Australia, the particular reasons why it's such a prominent development in Australia, you get a significant portion of your customers producing what they use on their rooftop, essentially free of charge once you make the investment in the solar panels. So you might say, well, what's interesting about this? Well, what's interesting about this is if you go to the state of South Australia, on many sunny Sundays where industrial and commercial production is low, the rooftop solar generation meets virtually all of the demand on the network. So during the sunny hours in the afternoon, you don't need fossil fuel plants to generate electricity. Now it's kind of bizarre because once the sun sets, you need that. So Dr. Al-Moneef can rest comfortable that fossil fuels will have a role to play during the night. But there's another development, and that is storage. The cost of storage is falling rapidly. So if you have solar panels and you run out of energy at night, well, you can store some of that excess sun during the day and use it at night. And of course, the next development is electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are essentially nothing but storage on wheels. So you add these developments together, these trends, and you begin to see an interesting future where consumers, at least in the electricity sector, will begin to essentially become semi-self-sufficient. They would still need connection to the network, they would still need support from the grid and things of that nature. But this is happening in Australia, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in California, it's happening in Hawaii, it's happening in many parts of the world. And I believe that in the next decade or two, we will see more developments along these lines. So the significance for someone in the electricity power sector is that it breaks down the traditional supply chain relationships between the consumer and the supplier and the generator and the distribution companies, because consumers can not only self-generate, they can form communities or microgrids or energy communities, whatever you want to call them, and they can trade with one another. So if I have more solar energy that I can use, I can trade with my next door neighbor, or I can charge the other neighbor's electric vehicle and so forth. So these types of developments, which were unheard of in the old days, are beginning to become quite noticeable. So what this means is consumers, at least in the electricity sector, will no longer be passive consumers that just get stuff from upstream assets in the infrastructure. They can actually become producers, they can trade with their neighbors, they can form communities where they can trade and balance their supply and demand internally. So I tell you that if you go to meet people in the electric power sector, this is probably one of the most frightening scenarios that they think about, because it breaks down that traditional relationship of having a passive consumer that gets all of the kilowatt hours from the network and pays for it and so forth. That breaks down that relationship. So I think it's very important. Another interesting thing, and I will try to keep my comments brief, is that because there's so much renewables, both utility scale and small scale, and because renewables are variable, as we know, they come and they go, what is happening is the cost of a kilowatt hour from renewables is falling very rapidly, while the value of the flexibility in customer demand is rising. So if you're in the electric power sector, you like customers who use electricity when it's plentiful and cheap and don't use it when it's expensive and scarce. So if you have millions of customers, you know, in California, we're probably close to 1 million electric vehicles. We want as many of those cars to be charged during the sunny hours of the day where there's lots of sun and the cost is negative on many days. And you don't want them to charge after the sunset, particularly the period between 6 to 9 where the peak electricity demand occurs. So this is a super interesting phenomenon. And I don't think it's something that the oil industry or fossil fuel industry understands, or at least deals with this. But in the electricity, everything is in real time. So when people consume or store or share or trade or generate and so forth is very important. So we are beginning beginning to see distribution companies and retailers starting in places in Australia, California, Hawaii, Utah, so forth, sunny parts of the world with high concentration of distributed solar. These companies are now offering you free solar panels and free storage with a catch. And the catch is I control when the battery gets charged and discharged. So I control the behind the meter assets. In exchange, I get your flexible consumption. So the value of flexible demand is rising relative to the value of the kilowatt hours generated on the rooftop and stored in the battery and so forth. I find this phenomenon, so there are companies here in Bay Area and San Francisco where they would offer you a free solar panel on your roof and a battery in exchange for you allowing them to manage when energy is produced, consumed, and traded and shared and things of that nature. Okay, so what is the bottom line? Well, the bottom line is, if you're in the electricity power sector and you're projecting long-term demand, this used to be very complicated. It's becoming far more complicated. It's not clear where demand will increase, demand on the network, that is, or remain flat, the peak electricity version of peak oil, or will increase because we're going to electrify everything, including transport. And would we have a net increase in electricity demand? It's a big question mark, and I think it's one of the issues that I find particularly interesting. Now, let me finish by saying that what I just said is very much dependent on where you are. In many sunny countries in the Middle East, including perhaps Saudi Arabia, I don't know all the details, but electricity prices are heavily subsidized. So rooftop solar is not as attractive as it is in, say, Hawaii. In Hawaii, electricity in some of the islands, it's 50 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you can generate power on your rooftop for free, why would you buy it at 50 cents a kilowatt hour? Same in California, same in Australia, but maybe in many parts of the world, the electricity price is not right. And I came across an interesting statistic, which kind of blew me away, and I'll just share it with you. An average refrigerator in America uses 6 times as much electricity as a typical or average citizen in Tanzania. So there are huge inequalities in how much we use, what we use it for, where we get it from is, the price issue and so forth. So there's what I just described is happening in certain parts of the world. I think they're going to happen in other parts of the world, but at different speeds. So with that, I thank you again. I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. It's good to see all your faces, and I hope that along with everyone else, we can join in person next year in Rome or Milan or wherever you're holding your conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your communication, because the changes, the current and future changes in the electricity market will be influential on the behavioral changes which are critical to achieve the climate targets. Now, I ask if there are questions about the speech you have heard. Please raise the hands. No? No questions? If so, today's session is over. Next section will start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Central European Time. Goodbye to everybody.
Yes.
Goodbye, and
Thank
thank
you very
you.
much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Very
Good seeing everyone.
Lucille. Thank you, and Matteo. Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, Perry.
Good seeing you, Carlo.
Bye, ciao.
Okay, bye. Marsalama.